Most people are familiar with the concept of you put a frog in a pot of water at room temperature, that you can slowly increase the temperature of the water, and the frog will be oblivious to it until it becomes detrimental to the frog. And that's the nature of the animal being cold-blooded. But a lot of times, I think we don't necessarily recognize how that happens to us spiritually. That things are going well and seem fine on the outside, but we're putting ourselves in dangerous situations that can be very harmful to ourselves just because we've gotten used to them. And that's what happens in the book of Judges. We get to the story of Gideon, and we start to see a shift. And in chapter 8, Gideon's story ends, and I'm not going to read all of this. We're going to look at chapter 8 and 9 in the book of Judges today. Because in chapter 8, we see that Gideon is going after the Midianites. He had essentially defeated them, but they had to kind of finalize the victory and make it 100% secure. And as he does this, he encounters the Israelite tribe of Ephraim. Remember, there were 12 tribes in Israel, and Ephraim was the second biggest tribe. Judah was the biggest. Ephraim was the next one, but they were still very powerful. Still a lot of them, still strong in many ways, and would often help in the battles. Well, Ephraim comes up to Gideon and says, hey, why didn't you call us? And they have kind of this back and forth argument. But Gideon shows his shrewd leadership, and he is able to calm their frustrations so it doesn't escalate. And everybody's happy and everybody's good. But then Gideon is going after the Midianites. And he comes to the towns of Succoth and Peniel. And then he goes there and he says, hey, my men are exhausted. Give us food to eat so we can pursue and finish off the Midianites. And in both towns, what essentially happened is the people of the town said, you know what? When you win, you come back and you talk to us. Because what was happening is the people in those towns, they didn't want to support the losing side. They didn't want to support Gideon if Gideon was going to lose, because then the Midianites would come back and say, what are you doing? And they would be punished for that. So as Gideon leaves them, he says, when we come back, we're going to bring judgment upon you. And so Gideon goes and he defeats the Midianites, and he comes back to Succoth and Peniel and essentially destroys them, punishes them for their behavior. And so we see that Gideon acts differently with those people than he did with Ephraim. And part of it is Ephraim was a tribe of Israel, and there was just kind of a personality conflict with that. But Succoth and Peniel were rebelling against God, and so Gideon said, we have to deal harshly with this. But after everything is all said and done, we see Gideon's personality is beginning to shift. Because in chapter 6, we find Gideon is timid, he's unsure, he's uncertain, he doesn't want to take initiative, and now we see a bold, sometimes courageous leader, other times vindictive leader that Gideon becomes. But he's also an opportunist. See, when he was defeating the enemies, he took the spoils of war for himself. And then at the end, the people come and they say to Gideon, say, hey, be our king. We want you to rule over us. Gideon declines. He says the right thing. He says, God is our king. But, he kind of adds another little caveat to that. I'm not going to be your king, but I want each of you to give me a gold ring. And essentially what it was is Gideon was saying, you need to recognize my leadership, the sacrifice that I've done for you. And so they all agree, and they all give him a gold ring. And I believe most texts say it was like 1,700 shekels. And it's about 43 pounds of gold. And if you look up the price of gold today, that's about $1.2 million worth of gold that Gideon received. So that's a significant amount. This was not just some small passing token of appreciation. This was a huge amount for Gideon to receive. And we see, he said, no, I'm not going to be your king, but I'm going to take advantage of the situation. I'm going to take what should be mine. And there's a few other things in Gideon's life that say, you know what, this doesn't necessarily add up to a God-honoring situation. Because later in the story, we find that Gideon had 70 sons, 70 sons. He had many wives and concubines as well. And we find throughout Scripture, there's a lot of times where there are large families, and that's not necessarily uncommon. But what it speaks to, the amount of sons, 70 sons that Gideon had, shows that Gideon was living differently than everybody else. He said, I'm not going to be your king, but yet he was living like a king. Because the only way to be able to support a family of that size was to be a king-type person. Just because somebody had a little bit of money, they could not support that size of family. So Gideon is living inconsistently. He's saying the right things. I'm not going to be your king because God is our king. Yet he was living in a way that was kingly, was king-like. But another thing that he did is when he got the gold earrings, the 43 pounds of gold earrings, he made an ephod, which if you know the Old Testament or familiar with the priestly rituals, the high priest would wear an ephod. It was like this breastplate that was very ornate, had different precious stones on it, and Gideon made himself an ephod. He was living like a king, but then he made this ephod, which gave him, in his mind, priestly responsibilities and priestly authority. Now, if you remember, the first king of Israel was Saul. And one of the things that really was his undoing was that when he started doing some of the priestly responsibilities, God said enough is enough, and that was the beginning of the end for Saul. And so Gideon is doing some of the same things that Saul would do later, is that he was the ruler, he was the king, but he also was doing some of the religious rituals as well. And so there are inconsistencies with Gideon. He did a lot of good, and I'm not trying to downplay that or get rid of it, but I'm trying to make sure we recognize that there are things that Gideon did that were imperfect, that were against God. And one of the things I'm reminded of is that those who seek power are often corrupted by it. And we see that with Gideon to an extent, but under Gideon's leadership, Israel had peace for 40 years. Had a long period of peace, of rest, which was common, particularly in the early stages of the book of Judges. But after Gideon died, the sin really came back into Israel, and things began to turn in a negative way. And so we get to chapter 10, and we find his son Abimelech enters the scene. So I'm going to start in chapter 10, verse 1. It says, Gideon's son Abimelech went to Shechem to visit his uncles, his mother's brothers. He said to them and to the rest of his mother's family, ask the leading citizens of Shechem whether they want to be ruled by all 70 of Gideon's sons or by one man. And remember that I am your own flesh and blood. So Abimelech's uncles gave his message to all the citizens of Shechem on his behalf. After listening to his proposals, the people of Shechem decided in favor of Abimelech because he was their relative. They gave him 70 silver coins, which he used to hire some reckless troublemakers who agreed to follow him. He went to his father's home, and there on the stone he killed all 70 of his half-brothers, the sons of Gideon. But the youngest brother Jotham escaped and hid. Then all the leading citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo called a meeting under the oak tree beside the pillar of Shechem and made Abimelech their king. Now, as I said, there's a lot of subtle shifts that are happening throughout the book of Judges to show that the people are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. One of them we would not necessarily recognize in our English translations because the name of God changes. Up to this point, when God is mentioned, it's usually the name Yahweh, which is the name most people are familiar with. It's a sacred, the most sacred name for God. In fact, Jews won't even say the name Yahweh because they don't want to take the Lord's name in vain. They have that much reverence for it. Well, the word for God that is being used now is Elohim, which is still God. It's still recognizing his power and his deity, but it's not on the same level as Yahweh. So things are beginning to shift. And one of the reasons that we may conclude that this shift is happening is because we see that people are trying to control God. They're trying to control their destiny. They're trying to be their own God. Because really, what we worship controls us. Regardless of what that is, whether it's wealth, whether it's health, whether it's a sports team, whether it's our family, whatever it is, whatever we worship has control over us. Now, in the church, we would claim that God is sovereign, that He's all-powerful, and there's nothing outside of His control, but yet He still gives us freedom. And so we come to Abimelech. Now, Abimelech was the son of Gideon and Gideon's concubine from Shechem. And so because of that, he was shunned by the rest of his family. He was an outcast from his brothers. His brothers did not want Gideon to be any part of him. But we see that Gideon's name means my father is king. Abimelech's name means my father is king. And so we see that Israel has already asked Gideon to be their king, and he named one of his sons, and his son's name means my father is king. But one of the things that the Old Testament does a lot is that it's very ambiguous in what it really means. Because to say my father is king could mean that Gideon is king. That Gideon is the king. He's living like a king in this place, and so he's actually the king. But it also could be referring to God, that God is the king of Israel. And so it has ambiguity, sometimes to make us think, so that we can't just brush off the story and not allow it to infiltrate us. So we see that Gideon was living like a king, named his son, my father is king, and this son of his, Abimelech, was an outsider from birth. But Abimelech was pretty shrewd. You know, him going to Shechem in the way he did was pretty wise from a political standpoint. Do you want to be ruled by 70 of my brothers, or do you want to be ruled by me? And while we can say it's nice to have representation, the 70 was not necessarily representation. It wasn't like they were elected officials who would vote on certain things. It was 70 tyrants, 70 dictators, 70 people that really had no control or no controls in their life to prevent them from extorting their power. And so he goes to them and he says, hey, I'm different than these other 70 guys because I'm one of you. He uses his mother's heritage as a way to show Shechem that he is one of them. He's saying, I am one of your brothers. But we see the story is silent about God. We don't see God being mentioned in this story because this story is about humans seeking power. And those who seek power are often corrupted by it. And we'll see that Abimelech falls into that trap. Because all the other judges in the book of Judges are appointed or blessed by God on some level. We see that there's some affirmation from God that this person, whoever it was outside of Abimelech, was directed by God. Abimelech is out for himself. He is seeking power. And we see he kills 70 of his brothers. Now, this is one of the problems with monarchies, particularly ancient monarchies, is that they were very, very bloody. That if there was a posed threat, the one in control would do all they could to get rid of that threat. And sometimes that meant you had to kill those that were close to you. And he killed his 70 brothers on a stone. You know, the concept of stone has come up before in Gideon's story and will come up once more. But we see that this is a theme that's been going on throughout Gideon and his family's story. And we see Abimelech is connected to Gideon because like Gideon, Abimelech is shrewd and at times he is cruel. And so he hired troublemakers or mercenaries to be his soldiers. He paid people to be his fighting machine. They created terror. They created frustration. They allowed Abimelech to have control. But there's some irony and foreshadowing that's happening here. Abimelech goes to Shechem and says, I am one of your brothers. I am part of your family. Would you rather me rule you or these other 70 people? And they said, well, we'd rather have one of our brothers rule us, one of our family be in charge. And so they make that happen. All the while, Abimelech goes and destroys his family. He says, I'm one of you. I'm your family. But he goes and kills his family as well. See, those who seek power are often corrupted by it. But Jotham survived. One of the sons of Gideon survived. And we see he survives and he makes a prophetic statement, a prophetic story. And he talks about the trees. He says the trees, one day were looking for a king. And they said to the olive tree, be our king. The olive tree said, I don't want to stop making olives. And then it said to the fig tree, be our king. And the fig tree said, I don't want to stop making figs. And then it said to the grapevine, be our king. The grapevine said, I don't want to stop making grapes and wine. Then the tree said to the thorn bush, be our king. And the thorn bush said, if you bow down to me, I will be your king. And then Jotham concludes it in verse 19 of chapter 10. He says, if you have acted honorably and in good faith toward Gideon and his descendants today, then may you find joy in Abimelech. May he find joy in you. But if you have not acted in good faith, then may fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leading citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo. And may fire come out of the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. So Jotham escaped, and we see a lust for power is driving all of the narrative, all of the story, and what is happening. And one of the questions I've always wondered when I'm thinking of this particular story is, why didn't anybody stop Abimelech? As Abimelech was killing his 70 brothers, who was sitting over there saying, this is a really good idea? I mean, but I think that happens a lot of times. That we think, well, maybe somebody else will stop it. Maybe it's somebody else's responsibility. And we do that in our society today. Well, somebody else can take care of that. Somebody else can stop that evil. But Jotham's parable was not just him on a soapbox. It was a prophetic warning that he was giving. The thorn bush represents Abimelech. Some of your versions may say bramble. We see that it's something that really has no value. That the thorn bush doesn't produce anything that's worthwhile. It just chokes out the other plants. It can hurt anything that comes into it. And all it's really good for is kindling for fire. That's all it's good for. It's not good for anything else. Shechem rejected Gideon, rejected Yahweh, and was going on their own way. And so now Abimelech and Shechem, their destinies are tied together. And what Jotham is describing, what he's prophesying, is that they would destroy each other. But in this, Jotham reminds us of the sacrifices that Gideon made. And I want to make sure I'm not being overly harsh on Gideon, because there were a lot of things he did that were really, really good. He faithfully followed God. He did what God commanded him. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He didn't always do things the way he was supposed to, but he fought for the people. But Abimelech was destructive and would destroy those around him. Then we come to verse 22, and it says, after Abimelech had ruled over Israel for 3 years, God sent a spirit that stirred up trouble between Abimelech and the leading citizens of Shechem, and they revolted. God was punishing Abimelech for murdering Gideon's 70 sons and the citizens of Shechem for supporting him in his treachery of murdering his brothers. And so we find there are many verses there of how this unfolds. See, God gives us a freedom of choice, but in the end, God's will is done. Right? We can choose to do what we want to do, but that doesn't mean we're actually going to thwart God's plans. And on some level, this should give us confidence, because we're imperfect. We are going to make mistakes. Even if you are the best follower of Jesus that has ever existed, you are imperfect. But we can be rest assured that no matter how imperfect we are, if we faithfully follow Jesus, he's going to make things work out as they're supposed to work out. Now, we have sin. There's destruction of sin in this world. We have consequences of sin. I'm not trying to say everything's going to be all easy, but to recognize that if we're trying to follow Jesus, that's all we have to do. It's not dependent upon us. It's dependent upon Jesus. And if we faithfully follow him, then we're where we need to be. See, God eventually restores order, and he does so with Abimelech and Shechem. Because what happens is a new person named Gaal moves into Shechem and essentially says, why are we following Abimelech? Who's this guy that he should be our leader? And stirs up trouble, and eventually that gets back to Abimelech. And we know how Abimelech has treated his threats when he killed his brothers. And so he comes out and he fights against this guy named Gaal, and he destroys them. But Abimelech is not done yet. He's not satisfied with that. He says, you know what? Shechem's been causing problems. They've been stealing money from me. They allowed this guy Gaal to do things that he shouldn't have done. And so he goes, and then he attacks Shechem, and he destroys the city. He defeats everybody there, but that's not enough for him. He goes and he throws salt on their farm ground so their farm ground can no longer produce good things. So not only does he kill people, he makes the land desolate. But everybody gets trapped in a temple. And so Abimelech says, I know how to solve this. He goes, he gets some firewood, he lights it on fire, and he burns everybody inside of the temple. It's pretty gruesome, isn't it? That's pretty cruel. We see that's what Abimelech did. Now remember, God is silent in this story, but God is not absent. I think we have to recognize the importance of that, because there are times in our lives where we feel God is not speaking to us. There are times God may be silent in our lives, but that doesn't mean He's absent. He is still there. He is still present. He is still working out His plans in our world. And I'm not trying to say this was just a great thing, but a lot of times what happens is evil devours itself. When two evil forces come together, they devour each other. Now, that doesn't mean evil is gone. There's going to be another evil to come up to take their place. Evil exists in this world. We see that God allowed Abimelech to bring the destruction that Jotham prophesied, that Shechem was destroyed. We see those who seek power are often corrupted by it. And we see Shechem is destroyed by this power that was sought by Abimelech. But as we finish up chapter 10, starting in verse 50, then Abimelech attacked the town of Thebes and captured it. But there was a strong tower inside of the town, and all the men and women, the entire population, fled to it. They barricaded themselves in and climbed up the roof of the tower. Abimelech followed them to attack the tower. But as he prepared to set fire to the entrance, a woman on the rooftop dropped a millstone that landed on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. He quickly said to his young armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me. Don't let it be said that a woman killed Abimelech." So the young man ran him through with his sword, and he died. When Abimelech's men saw that he was dead, they disbanded and returned to their homes. In this way, God punished Abimelech for the evil he had done against his father by murdering his 70 brothers. God also punished the men of Shechem for all their evil. So the curse of Jotham, son of Gideon, was fulfilled. So as Abimelech attacks Thebes, it almost seems like, just the second verse of the same song. He has destroyed Shechem, attacked them, and everybody fled to one structure, and Abimelech burned it down. I mean, there are no details as to what was actually happening here, or to why Abimelech actually attacked Thebes. We might assume that they had similar loyalties to Shechem or had caused Abimelech problems like Shechem did. Maybe Abimelech was just mad and needed to get some more rage out, so we went and attacked another city. We don't necessarily know. But the destruction of God's people continues through the efforts of bad leadership. Through Abimelech's leadership, destruction continues. And so they flee to the tower, and we see, well, Abimelech's just going to burn it down like he did Shechem, but that's not how the story ends. He was killed by a woman dropping a stone from the tower, and that's how his story ends. Now the reason he talked to the armor-bearer about running him through was because it was disgraceful for a warrior to be killed by a woman, particularly an unarmed woman in that time. But yet, we remember the disgrace of Abimelech. We remember that he was killed because of this woman who threw a stone from the tower. So Jotham's curse is fulfilled. His prophecy is fulfilled with both Abimelech and Shechem. And it's interesting that once Abimelech died, his mercenaries were kind of like, well, I got stuff to do back home. I'm going to head out. We'll see you later. Their paycheck was gone. They weren't there for any reason except because they were paid to be there. They had no loyalty to Abimelech. They did their own thing, and so when Abimelech was gone, they found something else. The power that Abimelech sought had corrupted him, and when he was gone, he had no lasting, positive legacy. His rule reign was for 3 years, and after that, he was forgotten. He was discarded. The people moved on because of the destruction. But as I said, the concept of stone or rock was throughout the story of Gideon. We find that it began in chapter 6 when Gideon destroyed the stone altar and he built a new altar to God. He destroyed the idolatrous structure that was made to Baal and made a new one to Yahweh for the people to worship. We find that Abimelech killed his 70 brothers on a stone, and then Abimelech was destroyed by a stone himself. And as I think about the stones, stones are our foundation. They're what we build upon. It's the rock. What is our foundation? What is our rock? Because a lot of times we don't necessarily recognize it. We can be like that frog that, the water's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And it's becoming more and more dangerous. And we don't necessarily realize it until it gets to the point where we are consumed by it. Now today is the 200th sermon I have preached here in Iowa. And as I was thinking about that, it's such an honor and privilege that you've allowed me to last this long. But as I was thinking about the 200 concept of 200, the concept of the different sermons I've preached and what's been conveyed, I think I'm convinced more and more that it's real easy for us to look at this story and say, well, I'm not Abimelech, I'm good. But so many of us are acting like Gideon. And what I mean by that, we're doing a lot of good. We may be 85, maybe 90% doing good, but there were some big mistakes that Gideon made. And you know what Gideon produced? Abimelech. See, the problems the church is facing is not caused by the world. I think it's caused by too many people acting like Gideon. They're saying, you know what, we're going to follow Jesus 90% of the way, but we're going to skim off the top. We're going to get what's ours. If there's an opportunity for us to get ahead, we're going to make sure we take advantage of that. Now, I said Gideon produced Abimelech. I recognize we cannot control another person's spiritual decisions. If somebody if you've had a destructive history, or somebody's been mean to you, or abusive, or hurtful, or detrimental to your spiritual health, that's tragic, but we still have to own our spiritual relationship with Jesus. I want to make sure we don't have excuses for somebody else. But to recognize that, how am I like Gideon? Because the legacy we leave is based on our faithfulness to Jesus. It's not based on our bank accounts. It's not based on our social media accounts. It's not based on our homes, our neighbors, our friends. It's not based on anything except for who we are to Jesus. I'm reminded today of Luke chapter 2, of when the angel comes to tell the shepherds about this good news, that the Messiah was born. And as I think about that story in Luke chapter 2, I just get this picture that the angels are like bursting at the seams. They cannot control themselves. They want to share this. They are so consumed by the power of Jesus that they have to share that. They have to let other people know that it's here, that Jesus has broken into this world and he is changing lives. The kingdom of heaven is inaugurated with Jesus. It began, and we are living in that reality now. But I don't know if we're ready for that sometimes. I don't know if we're bursting with the seams about Jesus like we should be. We can say we are. Remember, Gideon said all the right things. I'm not going to be your king. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this for Jesus. I'm going to make sure I sacrifice for Jesus over here. But yet we make these small compromises. Well, something else comes up better over here. Or Jesus, I'm not going to give everything to you. I'm going to keep a little bit for myself. I'm going to make sure I get mine. See, we can look at the story of Abimelech and say, I'm not as bad as he is. But I wonder, are we even as good as Gideon was? I mean, Gideon wasn't perfect. He made some colossal mistakes. And if we want to impact the world with the love and message of Jesus Christ, we have to first and foremost be completely impacted by the love and message of Jesus Christ ourselves. That's where we start. And we do that because of what Jesus did for us. Jesus has impacted us. He died for us. He died for you as an individual.